I'm indeed honored and pleased to be here this afternoon, Every time I come here to the Inner Harbor, I'm always have to kind of pinch myself because I grew up not more than 6 blocks from this building. And I have so many good and bad memories. But never did I dream that I would be standing in front of an audience of some of the finest lawyers from all over the country, if not the world. So I, first of all, want to stop by here to thank you for doing what you do. You have a very important task, and I want to give you a little bit of insight as to what's happening in Washington and also what's not happening. So welcome to Baltimore, a complex city and community that have been and remain at the center of our nation's continuing struggle for civil and human rights. Welcome to the place where our nation's star-spangled banner proclaimed our freedom, and also the place from which Frederick Douglass escaped slavery. Welcome to the birthplace of Justice Thurgood Marshall and Clarence Mitchell, Jr., and also the birthplace of de jure residential segregation. Welcome to the home of some of the finest medical institutions in the world, and also the city in which the life expectancy in largely black Sandtown, Winchester, where I live, is 20 years less than in largely white Roland Park, a short distance away. Welcome to the home of the 19th century know-nothings and the place where the vision of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. took root in the minds of young black children, one of them named Elijah more than a half a century ago. I've often said that our children are the living messengers we send to a future we will never see. And I do believe that I am a messenger for generations that went before me, but that I had an opportunity and the privilege to have my life eclipsed with theirs. And so I'll begin with a personal reflection about the impact on my family and our ongoing struggle for universal civil rights. As lawyers, the lives of individual Americans are where our social justice work must find its most lasting meaning. Robert and Ruth Cummings, my mother and father, struggling as sharecroppers in Manning, Clarendon County, South Carolina, on the same land where our ancestors had been slaves. As a matter of fact, if you were to go to that land today, the very family that enslaved my family still own the land. So we're not that far from slavery. Living in the place that gave America Briggs versus Elliott, one of the 5 cases that later would be decided under the shared designation of Brown versus Board of Education. Many of my relatives were plaintiffs in the Briggs case. Many of them suffered greatly in the Briggs case. They were punished in all kinds of ways because they merely wanted to have a better life. During World War II, Philip Randolph convinced President Roosevelt to integrate our nation's defense industry. As a result, father and mother could move from South Carolina to South Baltimore in order to create a better life for their children. Now let's make it abundantly clear. My mother and father were worried about their children. And so they made a decision very early on, as soon as they got married, that they would move to Baltimore. As I said, and live not very far from here, where we sit today, in a small 3-room house where we ended up with 7 children and 2 adults. Now you can imagine, with 1 bathroom, what the mornings were like. You had to get up at 2 o'clock in the morning just to get a spot. And so in Baltimore, I was disparaged and excluded, placed in special education in a poor and still segregated South Baltimore elementary school. Yet we survived and thrived because of our faith that a day would come when the good in Americans would outweigh the failings. And so what I bring to the discussion, and when you hear me in the Congress, it is not simply somebody from South Baltimore or West Baltimore who so happens to be progressive. You're talking about somebody who has lived the pain, who has seen it and felt it. And so it is part of my DNA, the things that I talk about, and the reason why today I find myself in tremendous pain about my country. Now let me be clear with you that a lot of people don't realize how much trouble we're in. But you as lawyers should know, we're in trouble. I don't care whether you are Republican, Democrat, Independent, or whatever. The very rule of law is being challenged today to its nth degree. And we have to fight back. And again, I want to be clear. I'm not talking about a Republican agenda. I'm not talking about a Democratic agenda. I'm talking about a human agenda, and one that anybody who is an American should want. And so, ladies and gentlemen, you who are engaged in the social justice mission of our profession are living proof of our faith. And in this spirit, here's my own personal insight about the value of your calling, because you do have a very, very important calling. Along with other black children in South Baltimore neighborhood, my neighborhood, I received my first personal lesson about the struggle for civil rights at a swimming pool called Riverside. Now, Riverside is about 15 blocks from where we are right now. And even in the free state of Maryland, black children like us were barred from the pool by the cruelty of segregation, co-signed by the color of our skin to a small aging wading pool at Sharp and Hamburg Street, a pool that was so small that we were forced to take turns to be able to sit in the cool water. And then one day, when I was about 9, our recreation leader, along with a woman named Juanita Jackson Mitchell, came along and they said to us, "We want you children to have a better life. You should not have to wait hours upon hours to sit in a pool, a wading pool, that is that take up about 4 of these tables and is 2.5 feet deep, when there's an Olympic-sized pool within blocks." And they said that we're going to give you a chance to swim in that pool. And they said, "Don't you want to go?" And of course we said, "Oh yeah, we want to go." The thing that they did not tell us was that it was segregated. They didn't tell us that. And so for 7 days, we children marched not far from here, trying to integrate a pool. Now, I've often said that children don't think the way adults do. All I knew was I was trying to get to a pool, and I knew that there were some angry white people who were beating me up on my way trying to get to the pool. I did not understand it. I had not done anything to them. I simply was trying to get in a pool. And so, again, after the seventh day, all of the papers said the pool was integrated, but the piece that they did not say is that many of us were beaten. Many of us, and I still do, have the scars from just trying to get our rights. Well, you know what it did for me? It made me realize that I did have rights. It also made me realize that I might have to stand up to get the rights. I still didn't understand why what I did done to anybody to deserve the treatment that I got. But I knew that I was now swimming in a pool. My friends, I would submit to you that this difficult but uplifting memory speaks to the essence of our progressive vision for our nation and our world. It is at the heart of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and our continuing defense of equal access to public accommodations. As Eleanor Roosevelt once insightfully observed, and this is one of my favorite quotes, she said, "Where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small places, close to home. They are the world of the individual person, where every man, woman, and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity without discrimination. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere." End of quote. So the pool was my world. It gave my life meaning, and it is what propelled me and changed the trajectory of my destiny. Now, when I look back on my life, probably this pool incident was probably the most significant incident in my young years to change the trajectory of my destiny. And let me tell you why. I didn't know who this woman was, Juanita Jackson Mitchell. I knew that she had a T-shirt on that said NAACP. I didn't know what that meant. But one thing I did know is that she led us to the pool. One thing I did know is that as we were beaten and blood was running down my face, and I can still remember it, I will never forget her taking her dress and wiping the blood off of us. And you know what? I made a decision that day that whoever she was and whatever she did, I wanted to be like Juanita, whatever she was. And I asked the question, who was that lady? And somebody said that she's a lawyer. I said, that's what I want to be. I made that decision, and so that basically shaped my life. But how could one in my state of affairs, and that is being in special ed, how dare somebody like me even think that I could become a lawyer? So by recalling this childhood experience, I'm not saying that the integration of the swimming pool in South Baltimore changed the course of American history. What I can and will share with you is the experience transformed my life. Before those marches at Riverside, I never experienced having a right that other people had to respect. Yet, after we gained the right to swim in the public pool, I did have a right that was important to me, a right that others had to respect. And that realization made all the difference in the world and the way I viewed myself and our world. Learning that I had a right, meaningful to me, that others had to respect, and set on the course that brought me to this luncheon today. As a lawyer, I litigated for 20 years before being elected to Congress. I had faith that our federal courts would be the primary guardians of our civil rights. 2 decades later, however, I must acknowledge that my faith in our Supreme Court as the ideologically neutral guardian of our civil rights has been severely shaken. And I'm not one that gets shaken easily. This is why I am now convinced that the primary path to defending our democracy and advancing our civil and human rights must be through the political electoral process. And this is where the urgency of our struggle as citizens to advance and protect our voting rights comes into play. In 1957, 3 years after Brown versus Board, Dr. King echoed the pain of millions of Americans in his "Give Us the Ballot" speech at the prayer pilgrimage for freedom. And this is what he said. He said, all types of conniving methods. Now, keep in mind, this is 1957. All types of conniving methods are still being used to prevent Negroes from becoming registered voters. And so our most urgent request to the President of the United States and every member of Congress is to give us the right to vote. End of quote. 1957. Then, in his I Have a Dream speech during the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, Dr. King responded to those who were asking him and other advocates for universal civil rights, quote, when will you be satisfied? And this is what he said. We cannot be satisfied, he declared, as long as a Negro in Mississippi cannot vote and a Negro in New York believes he has nothing for which to vote. Half a century after Dr. King's death, these words retain a haunting relevance for the Americans of our time. Once again, as in 1957, all types of conniving methods are being utilized to prevent American citizens from registering to vote and having their votes counted. Voter suppression remains a clear and present danger to the effective functioning of our democratic republic, and it must be stopped. The thing that upsets me probably more than anything else is when I talk to some of my colleagues, they seem not to understand how significant this is. They seem to want to believe that there's something called, what do they call it? They call it something else. But they talk about voter integrity, but they don't want to talk about voter suppression. There's something wrong with that picture, I'm sorry. And, you know, and one of the things, let me give you a footnote, Mr. President. One of the reasons why this is so near and dear to me is that my mother on her deathbed, who died about a year ago after suffering a stroke 2 years prior. I went to see her and she was, we knew she would die any minute, and she knew she would die any minute. And I knew she wanted to tell me something, and so I was in the hospital. So I got a pass to get out of the hospital. I didn't know it would be so hard to get out of a hospital. I just wanted to go for 3 hours to see my mother. And when I went to see her, there she was, this frail woman who had lost half her weight, this woman who had built her own church, who had raised her 7 children, who was a faithful wife, a domestic, and a preacher. And now she was about to die. She had one word that she wanted to leave with me. My sister told me, get here fast because Mom is not going to last very long. So when I got there, I spent the first hour telling her how much I loved her and how much she meant to me. But then I wanted to hear what it was that she had to say. And she kept pointing to a piece of paper on the table next to her. And any of you all who have ever been around somebody who suffered a stroke know that when they lose speech, it's hard. It's hard to understand them, and it's almost like trying to get a small child, to coax some words out of a small child. So I kept saying, Mother, what are you saying? And she kept pointing at something. So I looked over and I noticed that there was a piece of paper that she was pointing to. And I wondered what this was, and so I picked up the piece of paper, and come to find out it was a ballot. It was a ballot with my picture on it. You know, the ones that you take into the voting booth. And I said, Mother, what are you saying? And she kept, and I could not understand it, Mike. Couldn't understand it. And she kept pointing. And I kept, one word I did get understand was vote. Finally, I figured it out. She said, don't let them take away our right to vote. And then she died. That's serious business for me. And I do not understand why it is that there are people in the Congress of the United States who know and make it their business almost to suppress people's right to vote, who act like it's no big deal. I've often said that, in a way, I wish I was not a Democrat. I wish there was no such thing as a Republican. I am tired of people assuming that everything that I say is simply a Democratic message filtered through a Democratic prism, and I wish they would just understand it is what I want as an American citizen, period. And so when millions of Americans conclude that our democratic process is failing them because it is rigged, we are facing a process that threatens threaten the proper functioning of our republic, and that we as lawyers must address. Now let me say this, that you, all of us, we are so blessed to be equipped with law degrees. We really are. One of the reasons why I wanted to go to law school, too, is I wanted to know what it is that underpins this society. And I wanted to know what my rights were when the police stopped me. And I wanted to know how did I deal with somebody who might hit me or something that may happen in my community. I wanted to know about civil rights. I wanted to know all of that. But you are the witnesses. See, a lot of people don't know what you know. They don't know. They're going around here saying, as if they act like this democracy is something that we can take for granted. And so often we do take this democracy for granted. People ask the question, how did we get here? Well, I'll tell you how we got here. We got here because there are a lot of people that don't value our democracy. They have not been to Nigeria where you had to pay a bribe to walk from one block to the other. They haven't been to Colombia where union leaders are beaten up and killed. They haven't been to these various places where you got dictators for 20 or 30 years. They haven't been to places like Russia where the freedom of the press is just ridiculous. They haven't been there. And so they look at this democracy and they take it for granted, and they assume that when we have a little hiccup, like it's not a little hiccup, but a hiccup, like income inequality, or an African American becoming the president of the United States of America, they suddenly say, we better bring somebody in here to change this. We got to bring somebody in. What do they say? Shake it up. Well, we've gotten shaken. We've gotten shaken real bad. So, few of us today need a refresher case in constitutional law But consider these facts, and then I'll close. Consider this. Until its June 25th, 2013 decision in the Shelby County versus Holder voting rights case, the Supreme Court had respected the express constitutional authority granted to the Congress by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. It had been clear that voting rights legislation would be upheld against facial attacks as long as the congressional legislation was rationally related to enforcement of the 15th Amendment's constitutional guarantees. However, as we all know, in its appalling assertion of judicial activism in Shelby, a slim 5-4 Supreme Court majority all but usurped the clear constitutional power and duty of Congress to legislatively protect minority voting rights. The explicit delegation of that power of enforcement to the Congress and not to the Supreme Court reflected the 19th century failures by the Supreme Court where slavery, citizenship, due process, equal protection, and the suffrage were concerned. Then and now, the power of voting was the key. On 4 occasions prior to Shelby, the United States Supreme Court had upheld the constitutionality of the judgments that we in the Congress have made, including our judgment that Section 5 preclearance requirements of the Voting Rights Act are essential to maintaining equal voting rights for all Americans. And as recently as 2006, we in the Congress reaffirmed our judgment that Section 5 remains vital to ensure that the minority voters have free and full access to the polls in the jurisdictions affected. In so doing, we considered an extensive factual record, a record that found to be especially significant by the lower federal courts that have reviewed the recent challenges to Section 5. That evidence included intentional discrimination as documented by continued disparities in registration and turnout, the amount of Section 2 litigation, and the evidence of racially polarized voting, among other factors. Our judgments in 2006 have proven well-founded. During the 2012 presidential election, Section 5 preclearance process reduced the discriminatory effect of a South Carolina voter ID law and blocked a stringent Texas photo ID law. Likewise, litigation arising from Texas redistricting validated Congress's concern that intentional racial discrimination in voting continues to pose a credible threat to the rights of minority voters. In short, the Supreme Court in Shelby County was presented with an abundant record justifying the continued application of Section 5, preclearance requirements to Alabama and other affected jurisdictions, clearly enough to pass muster under the court's rationality-related tests. And so it is that as Justice Ginsburg observed in her dissent, along with Justice Breyer, Sotomayor, and Kagan, and this is what she said: the question this case presents is who decides whether, as currently operative, Section 5 remains justiciable, this court, or a Congress charged with the obligation to enforce the post-Civil War amendments by appropriate legislation. Now, ladies and gentlemen, in my view, the so-called conservative majority in Shelby County no longer deserves that appellation. Having engaged in the most egregious act of judicial activism since Bush versus Gore, that decided the 2000 presidential election. Acting in the wake of 2011 redistricting plans and 2012 civil rights violations, the Shelby County majority thrust the issue of equal and universal voting rights back into the forefront of our national political challenges. Long before our 2016 presidential election, advocates for fair elections that engage all Americans on equal terms decried the weakening of our protections against voter suppression occasioned by misguided Supreme Court majority. In the 114th Congress, for example, I was honored to join Republican Congressman Jim Sensenbrenner, Democratic Congressman John Conyers, Jr., and more than 100 other legislators in co-sponsoring the Voting Rights Amendment Act of 2015, legislation that would have repaired much, although not all, of the injury to our voting rights that the Shelby decision has allowed. Our proposed legislation never received an up or down vote, never received a vote in the Republican-dominated House. As a result, Republican legislatures in many states made it far more difficult for untold numbers of voters to cast their ballots in 2016. In sharp contrast to the president's assertions of widespread voter impersonation, the evidence of voter suppression in the Republican-dominated states is compelling, although the undemocratic methods vary. State voter rid laws, unwarranted purging of the voter rolls, racially gerrymandered the congressional districts, and consciously understaffed and under-equipped voting precincts in minority areas are just some of the more obvious methods being utilized to thwart our constitutional right to free and fair elections. Taken together, these voter suppression methods do constitute a fraud, but this voter fraud is being committed by reactionary state legislators against the American people and our constitutional right to choose those who we truly want to govern us and those who reflect our values. These politically motivated efforts to rig our elections may already have had far-reaching, destabilizing, and dangerous consequences. Deprived of a president who takes his constitutional obligation to protect our voting rights seriously, and opposed by an administration that has gutted the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division, optimism about the future of our democracy may seem unrealistic. Nevertheless, in the wake of our congressional elections last year, I remain confident that our democratic system is stronger than any individual or political party. And let me make it abundantly clear. No one in this country is above the law. No. And we must make sure that sometimes I think there are people that think they are above the law. But we've got to be careful. And let me tell you what worries me. When I have a president, and again, I don't care who he was, if he was my father, I would say the same thing. Although Trump and I don't look alike, but I would say the same thing. When you have a president who is appointing people or nominating people to the bench who have never tried a case, the federal bench, I'm sorry. If you got people being nominated who are not even qualified to try a traffic ticket case to the federal bench, we're in trouble. And it demeans all of us who have worked so hard and given so much. And part of the problem, as I see it, is that what we do, we talk about making America a better country. I think every time we appoint people to various positions where they are not qualified or where we do not have the good of the country. Now understand, I know we may differ on how to deal with a problem, but when you send somebody to the EPA who does not believe in science to head it, that's a problem. It really is. It is a problem. I don't know whether you saw it in my committee the other day. In my committee the other day, we argued. I couldn't believe I was sitting there. We argued whether climate change affects all this, it's had an effect on our world. I mean, it was just amazing. And we had some of the most ludicrous arguments that I've ever heard in my life. And I'm beginning to ask myself, what are we doing as a nation? What we're doing is making ourselves less exceptional, less just excellent. And I'm very concerned about that. But let me close by saying this. Some kind of way, we've got to get back to making sure that people can vote. I have lost my faith, at least during my lifetime, in the Supreme Court. I've lost it. When I think about what happened with my good friend Barack Obama and where he could not make his own appointment to the Supreme Court, and how that one move could change the course of history. Did. And I think the thing that pains me more than anything else is that a lot of the damage that Supreme Court will do with a few more Trump appointments, I gotta tell you, they will do enough damage that will not be corrected during my lifetime. And that's painful. And so I've stopped by here to beg you. I would ask, but asking is too cheap, to be the witnesses. Many of you are in positions where you argue these cases. Many of you, I'm sure, get a little depressed, like I do. Many of you ask the question, will you be able to make a difference? Well, let me tell you a little secret. If you don't stand up, if you don't fight back, if you don't fight to make this a more perfect union, then we will be run over. And I know that there are those who will walk out of here today and say, that Cummings, he just doesn't get it. You'll say that he just exaggerated. I know you will. I wish I was exaggerating. The information that I know, that many of you all don't know, I can tell you, there is nobody, listen to me, there is nobody in this country that would not have been indicted already if they had done what we know our president has done. I'm just telling you, nobody. We're better than that. And unless there's somebody fighting back, like Mueller, like the others who have stood up over and over again, and the ones who dare to try to make a difference. The little lady, Ms. Newbold, who was the person who worked in the White House, coming to us, Mike, shivering, saying that I'm seeing these things go on in the White House that are just not right with regard to security clearances. She said, I'm only 4 feet tall, a little bit taller than 4 feet. And Mr. Cummings, they take to humiliate me. When they thought I was a whistleblower, I'm almost finished. When they thought I was a whistleblower, they take the shelves and they actually build a shelf higher than I can reach it. No! We cannot have that. And so the question becomes, who will stand up? Who will stand up for this democracy? When you go to Disney World, there is a statement in Disney World at one of the pavilions. It says, we do not inherit our environment from our ancestors. We borrow it from our children. Ladies and gentlemen, you can say that about a lot of things. We borrow our democracy from our children. We borrow our way of life from our children. We borrow opportunity from our children. At the rate we are going, our children will not even know the democracy that we now have. Because they're coming up in an era where their very president is telling the press to shut up. Women are demeaned. Other folks are bullied. Omarosa is called a dog. And I ask the question, who would teach their children those things? If we don't gain anything else, let's gain this. Michael Cohen. So I've listened to Michael Cohen, and I've listened to him quite a bit. Michael Cohen said 2 things during our hearing that really stood out for me. And you know, the more I hear over these last few days, the more I believe him. He said one thing. He said that he did not believe that there would be a peaceful transfer of power. And he meant that. And if you listen to what has been going on, it's probably right. That's America. But he said something else. He said to my Republican colleagues, look where I am. Look where I ended up. I went along and I did all kinds of things. And I drank the Kool-Aid. Not only did I drink the Kool-Aid, I sold it. And now look where I am. I'm on my way to prison. And he basically said, wake up. Save America. And so I come to you. I would come asking, but asking is simply too cheap. I come begging. And why do I beg you? I beg you because you are best equipped to defend our democracy. You are best equipped to inform people of what is at stake. You are best equipped to stand up for generations yet unborn. You are best equipped. You are, each and every one of you, you are best equipped to make it possible for the little Elijahs to grow up, to have an opportunity to be all that God meant for them to be. But without you, we are doomed. And so we've been blessed to be given these educations. I don't care whether you graduated from Harvard or wherever, or Howard, or wherever you graduated from. The fact is that you have knowledge that a lot of people don't have. And now you must use it to the nth degree to make sure that we move towards a more perfect union. Thank you very much. That's my cue.